All right, today we're jumping into the hidden story of our global economy. It's a tale of big decisions, really unexpected disasters, and some groundbreaking deals that, believe it or not, still shape how we live today. Let's get into it.
Okay, that sounds like a bit of a random question, right? But the answer shows just how deeply interconnected everything is. In this explainer, we're going to see how these two events aren't just historical footnotes. They're actually key pieces in the giant puzzle of our modern world.
So our story kicks off back in the 19th century. This is where we see the birth of the very first truly global economy. And it all started with a single, massive decision made over in Britain.
So Britain got rid of its corn laws. Now these weren't about corn on the cob, they were laws that restricted cheaper food from being imported. The moment they were repealed, the effect was immediate and it was global. Suddenly British farmers couldn't compete. They were forced off their land, which kicked off this huge wave of migration to places like America and Australia. And to feed Britain's new appetite, massive areas in Eastern Europe, Russia, and the Americas were cleared for farmland. A single law in one country set off a worldwide chain reaction.
You know, economists look at this era and they see three big interconnected flows that really defined everything. First, you've got the flow of trade, goods like wheat and cloth crossing oceans. Second, the flow of labor, with millions of people migrating for a chance at a new life. And third, the flow of capital, money being invested across huge distances. The thing is, you can't separate them. Together, these three streams totally reshape the world.
Now, this whole global network was only possible because of new technology. Railways were like arteries, connecting farms deep inland to the coastal ports. The telegraph was a revolution. It meant instant communication between a merchant in London and one in New York. And refrigerated ships, they were an absolute game changer. For the first time, you could ship things like meat across an entire ocean without it spoiling. The world was literally shrinking. But this new global economy had a very dark side. In many places, especially across Africa, this era of connection was actually an era of conquest. European powers weren't showing up looking for trading partners. They came to take resources and to exploit labor.
And this brings us to one of the most tragic parts of this story. A cattle plague, a disease called rinderpest, was accidentally brought to Africa by Europeans. The impact was just catastrophic. It wiped out a staggering 90% of the continent's cattle.
This was so much more than just an agricultural crisis. It completely destroyed African livelihoods, which in turn handed immense power to the colonizers. With their main source of wealth just gone, many Africans had no choice but to take wage-paying jobs on plantations and in mines owned by Europeans. It's this really stark example of how a biological disaster was used to tighten the grip of colonial rule.
So let's fast forward a bit and see how this incredibly connected world faced its first huge test. The very things that powered all that 19th century growth also created a massive vulnerability. When one piece of the system failed, the whole global house of cards was at risk.
And the trigger? Black Thursday, October 24th, 1929. The stock market in the U.S. crashed. And it wasn't just an American problem. It was the spark that ignited the Great Depression, the worst economic collapse in modern history.
The dominoes just fell with terrifying speed. In the U.S. alone, thousands of banks went under and unemployment shot up. But the shockwaves were felt everywhere. Global trade just plummeted, down by 2/3. In colonial India, for example, both exports and imports were pretty much cut in half. That intricate web of global trade that had been built up so carefully, it just came completely apart.
In the aftermath of the Great Depression and World War II, world leaders knew that the old way of doing things was broken. So they came together with a pretty ambitious mission: to build a totally new, more stable global system from the rubble of the old one.
This historic meeting happened at a resort in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and the main goal was crystal clear: create a system that could prevent the kind of economic chaos they just lived through and make sure there was stability and jobs for the industrial world.
This conference gave birth to two huge institutions you've definitely heard of, often called the Bretton Woods Twins. First, the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, was set up to handle currency crises and keep international trade stable. And then there was the World Bank, created to fund all the reconstruction after the war and to support long-term economic development. The real key to this new stability was a system of fixed exchange rates. Now think of it like a global price list. Every country's currency was pegged to the US dollar at a set rate, and the dollar itself was backed by gold at a fixed price. This made everything predictable and stable for international trade, a huge change from the chaos of the years before the war.
So, for a while, the Bretton Woods system was seen as this massive success. But the prosperity it created wasn't exactly shared by everyone, and that inequality started to cause some serious tension and a powerful challenge from the developing world.
The results for the West were just mind-blowing. From 1950 to 1970, world trade was surging by over 8% every single year, and incomes were growing at a steady 5% a year. For Western countries and Japan, this was an absolute golden age of stable, incredible growth.
But this boom in the West was not happening everywhere. A lot of nations in Asia and Africa had just gained independence from colonial rule, and they felt like they were still trapped in an economic system that was rigged in favor of their old colonizers. So they banded together and formed the Group of 77, or G77, and their demand was revolutionary. They demanded what they called a new international economic order, or NIEO. And their vision was clear. They wanted real control over their own natural resources, they wanted fair prices for the raw materials they were exporting, and they wanted to be able to sell their manufactured goods in Western markets. Basically, they wanted to rewrite the rules of the global economy to make it fair.
So the G77's demands really exposed these deep inequalities in the system. But in the end, the Bretton Woods system wasn't brought down by this external pressure. It actually collapsed because of fatal flaws that were emerging from within.
By the 1960s, the financial strain of America's spending around the world, including the Vietnam War, started to weaken the U.S. economy. The U.S. dollar, the anchor of the entire system, could no longer be reliably backed by gold, so the link was broken, the system of fixed exchange rates fell apart, and the world entered a new era of floating currencies.
And this really marks the beginning of the globalization that we know today. The old system of fixed rates and Western dominance was gone. In its place, we got a new order defined by floating currencies and the rise of massive multinational corporations. These MNCs started moving production to low-wage countries, especially in Asia, and that fundamentally redrew the entire world's economic map.
So from the repeal of the Corn Laws all the way to the rise of global corporations, our economy has just evolved through this constant cycle of crisis and then reinvention. Each system solved the problems of its time, but it also created new ones for the future. And that brings us to a final, really crucial question. What are the defining economic challenges of our generation, and what new solutions are we going to have to create to meet them?